Thank you all so much for having me as part of this panel. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So I thought I would start, given that this is a panel on comparative and global perspectives on education. I thought I would start by reflecting a little bit on what I personally see as the value of a global and comparative lens. And a lot of this will actually tie in really nicely with the presentation that we've just heard. And so I'm really pleased about that. My own journey to comparative education was almost by accident. I stumbled upon the field during my master's studies, then did a PhD in comparative education. And even though I ultimately ended up as a sociologist, I think my work really remains fundamentally informed by insights from the field. And so I think one really important thing for me has been this idea that no country is an island. Right, so I understand that literally that is not true, but I think figuratively speaking, it is. Countries are connected in just innumerable ways, with really, really important implications for education systems, as we've just heard, right? This could stretch from colonial legacies to trade relationships, to political and diplomatic connections, to social and cultural ties, right? For instance, as a result of migration. And so I think one really enduring insight that a comparative lens brings is that education systems are interconnected with each other. They're not independent, they're shaped by one another. The second thing that I think for me a global and comparative lens brings is that it reminds us not only that countries are connected with each other, but they're also embedded in a global context that, as we've just heard, is itself filled with actors and institutions and ideas that influence education systems in fundamental ways, right? So we can think about global civil society, as we've just heard. We can think of the United Nations. We can even think of academics, much as ourselves, who travel the world as quote unquote global experts. And then lastly, what I think a comparative and global lens ultimately invites us to do is shift our perspective, right? I think we're very much used to thinking about education in national terms. And I think this is certainly true of most education research in the United States. And that's clearly very important. But I think when we think about education comparatively, we realize that something that might seem like a local educational problem actually has really important global and transnational dimensions. And so what I wanted to do in the time that I have is I wanted to sort of showcase some of these insights that a comparative lens brings by sharing some of my recent collaborative work on academic freedom. So certainly in the United States, academic freedom issues have been very much in the news recently. A number of you might have heard about worrying trends in Florida, where Governor DeSantis has really quite aggressively tried to restrict university teaching and other activities, especially as they pertain to race and racial inequality, to gender, to sexuality. Florida has been kind of an extreme case, but it's really a broader trend. We've seen a wave of similar attempts across the United States trying to restrict university teaching about these important issues. There's also been a wave of attempts to try and dismantle the tenure system in the US, which has long been seen as a really strong foundation for academic freedom. So very recently, for instance, the governor in Indiana signed into law a bill that undermines tenure protections in really quite significant ways. And so clearly what you might conclude from some of these cases is that it seems like the US currently is dealing with a pretty serious academic freedom issue. But then once we adopt a global and comparative lens, we recognize that this trend is not confined to the United States. it's a much broader global issue. So another example comes from Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban has generally worked to turn the country into what he calls an illiberal democracy, with quite severe attacks on, for instance, the judiciary, the electoral system, freedom of the press. But higher education has been really heavily affected too. So you might have heard about, for instance, the attacks on the Central European University, which ultimately left the country. But it's been a broader set of attacks, for instance, trying to establish institutions that are linked to the regime and exert much more powerful control over universities. And the regime even went as far as banning gender studies. Another country case comes from Turkey, where over the past decade, thousands of academics have been persecuted. So the Erdogan government has really tried to exert control over higher education through things like forced dismissals, prosecutions, criminal investigations of academics, enforced closures of universities, travel bans, and the like. And then a final example that I'll mention is China, where scholars have documented sort of a tightening space for academics on universities, with dissident professors and ethnic minority professors targeted, students deployed as watchdogs against their teachers, and increased sort of surveillance, for instance, through CCTV cameras in classrooms. And I could have added other countries to this list, including Brazil under Bolsonaro. But I think people on this call have, much more in-depth knowledge of that case. And so I will not go there. But this is clearly, a broader global trend. Now, you might think that these are just sort of anecdotal examples, but when we look at academic freedom data, we see real declines recently. So the graphs that I've shown here for the countries that I just talked about, they use a very new academic freedom index. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And you can see real declines in recent years, right? And then importantly, when we're looking at the global picture, similar trends are borne out, right? So this is the population-weighted global average of this academic freedom index that I just mentioned. So bigger countries like Brazil are weighted more heavily, right? But there is a real sort of decline in recent years. And so even though, attacks on academic freedom in the US are clearly important to understand in and of themselves, I think once we take a step back and sort of look at the global and comparative picture, we see that a much sort of broader question emerges, right? Why is it that we're now seeing this seemingly globalized wave of attacks on academic freedom? And so this is one of the questions that I've tried to tackle in a recent empirical study of academic freedom, together with my colleagues and collaborators, David John Frank and Evan Schofer, who are also at UCI. And so we studied academic freedom cross-nationally, quantitatively, from 1960 to today, covering more than 150 countries. And so what I wanted to do in the time that I have is share just a couple of findings from the study that I think illustrate the value of a global lens in education. So I don't actually want to say too much about data and methods, right, given the broad nature of this panel, but just a couple of words on how we're measuring academic freedom, because it's a very new and exciting data source. So we're using new data from the Varieties of Democracy data set, a new academic freedom freedom index that was recently released. It's a really exciting new data source that's publicly available. It covers all the kinds of dimensions of academic freedom that are routinely discussed in the literature. And so it's just a really exciting new tool that we have to understand academic freedom around the world. And so what we did in our research is we analyzed this data statistically using regression models to try and understand, what kinds of characteristics of countries, like, for example, regime type, are linked with academic freedom. I'm happy to talk more about data and methods if that's of interest in the Q&A. The findings that I'll show in a moment include a whole host of independent and control variables, right? And I'll be happy to talk more about that. So, one of the things that emerged from the existing literature on academic freedom, which consists of some really excellent country case studies of academic freedom in national contexts, is that a country's regime type is just hugely important when we're trying to understand academic freedom. And in particular, scholars have pointed out that whether a country is essentially governed as a democracy versus a more autocratic form of governance just matters hugely for the extent to which academics enjoy sort of like freedom of inquiry. And I think there's many, many reasons for why autocratic regimes tend to repress academics. I think a really important one is that free academic inquiry can sort of come into conflict with the regime, right? So academics might reveal findings that help them criticize government policies, for instance, right? They might reveal negative implications of what the government is doing. But then on the flip side, democratic regimes tend to institutionalize all kinds of freedoms, right, which sort of spill over into the academic arena. So for instance, they tend to have pretty strong norms of freedom of expression, right, which sort of like spill over. And in fact, what we found in our research is that thinking about national regime type is really, really important when we're trying to understand why we're seeing this sort of like wave of attacks on academic freedom cross-nationally. And so some of you will have heard about sort of organizations like Freedom House really ringing alarm bells about democratic declines in recent years. So 2022 marked the 17th consecutive year where more countries worldwide are experiencing democratic declines than are experiencing democratic improvements. And so what we found in our cross-national analysis is that these national democratic declines have played just a crucial role in undermining academic freedom, right? So what we found looking at this cross-nationally is that really whether a country has a democratic or an autocratic regime is one of the strongest predictors of academic freedom cross-nationally. And so clearly, national democratic declines are really important. But then as we were grappling with this topic, we really wondered, is this the full story here, right? And so, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, right, one of the key insights from comparative education is that national systems are interconnected, right? They're not independent, they're interconnected, they're shaped by the global context. And there's a huge literature in comparative education that shows that ideas and policies and practices, they travel the world, right? They diffuse globally. They can become institutionalized in global and international structures, like, for instance, the United Nations. And so we wanted to build on that insight essentially by recognizing that local or national struggles over academic freedom don't occur in a vacuum, right? So yes, national regime type is very important, but there's more that's to be unpacked here. And so in particular, we wanted to sort of go beyond the idea of looking at the extent to which the presence or absence of democracy at the national level shapes academic freedom. We also wanted to think about ways that authoritarian norms and practices that we know are pernicious to academic freedom can globalize, right? And so what we did is we sort of connected these long-standing insights from comparative education with new work in political science that looks at the ways that autocratic norms and practices are not confined by national borders. Autocratic norms and practices, they can spread from country to country as countries emulate each other, right? Or when sort of global waves of authoritarianism really sort of legitimize autocratic norms and practices on the global stage. And so you might think actually of Florida as a really good example of this, right? Where a number of commentators have sort of pointed out that in cracking down on higher education, Ron DeSantis is really sort of like following the playbook of Viktor Orban in Hungary, right? Specifically, for instance, in the attack on teaching about gender and sexuality. And so, in fact, what we found in our analyses is that controlling for national regime type, right, when there's a high global prevalence of autocratic regimes, that has a general sort of negative or dampening effect on academic freedom, right? So during time periods when there's a lot of autocracies in the world compared to democracies, then autocratic practices gain in legitimacy, right? They seem much more appropriate and legitimate. And we know that they're sort of pernicious to academic freedom, right? And so they travel. Not only that, but we found that academic freedom suffers especially when countries belong to what's been referred to as autocracy clubs. So these are essentially alliances between autocratic countries, international spaces where autocratic form of government is sort of assumed as the normative ideal. Right. And so really, the important point that I wanted to make here is that when we're thinking about the role of authoritarianism in undermining academic freedom, we need to be thinking not just at the national level, we need to be thinking about ways that authoritarian norms and practices travel globally. If you're interested in reading more about the paper, it's open access, published in the American Sociological Review, so you can go check it out. But what I wanted to do just very, very quickly is wrap up by sort of coming back full circle and thinking through what this analysis, I think, tells us about the value of a global and comparative lens in education. And so I think one thing that we recognize when we recognize that no country is an island is we recognize that US struggles over academic freedom don't occur in a vacuum, right? They're happening in other places around the world at the moment. And so there's a lot to be gained by studying these things comparatively and globally. The other thing that I think we show is that the global context really matters, right? What matters for academic freedom is not just what's happening at the national level. Autocratic norms and practices travel. They can gain global influence and legitimacy with overall really quite negative effects for academic freedom. And then I think the last point and sort of an overarching idea is that I think adopting a global and comparative lens, it sort of like shifts our perspective on academic freedom, right? Threats to academic freedom are best seen as a global issue. And so, what's happening in the United States vis-a-vis academic freedom is not only about the United States. It's something that's shaped by issues in academic freedom worldwide. So I'll stop here and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.